It is the sound of safety. When you are lying in a hospital bed, weak and helpless, that rhythm tells you that you are alive. It tells you that someone is watching over you, but for patients in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, that sound didn't mean safety. It meant he was in the room. Charles Cullen wasn't there to heal. He was a nurse who used his access to turn medicine into murder, silencing up to 400 lives, while the hospitals he worked for looked the other way. 9 hospitals, 16 years, dozens of suspicious deaths. And yet, Charles Cullen was never caught. He was never arrested. He was simply let go. Why? Because hospital administrators were terrified of lawsuits. Instead of calling the police, they fired him, gave him neutral references, and passed him on to the next hospital to kill again. This isn't just a story about a serial killer. It is a story about a corporate cover-up that cost hundreds of people their lives. Amy thought Charlie was her best friend. He was kind. He helped her lift patients. He played with her kids. He was the definition of a good nurse. She didn't know that the man sitting across from her in the cafeteria had just injected a lethal dose of insulin into a patient in room 302. She didn't know that her best friend was the most prolific serial killer in American history. And she didn't know that she was the only one who could stop him. Hospitals are sanctuaries. They are the one place on earth where we completely surrender our autonomy to strangers. We let them stick needles in our veins. We let them drug us into unconsciousness. We trust them with our lives because we believe in the sacred oath. First, do no harm. But Charles Cullen broke that oath on a scale that is hard to comprehend. While other serial killers hunted in dark alleys or lonely highways, Cullen hunted in the intensive care unit. To understand the making of a monster, we have to start in the fires of the burn unit. In 1987, Charles Cullen was hired at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. The burn unit is widely considered one of the most stressful environments in modern medicine. The air smells of antiseptic and charred flesh. The patients are in constant, agonizing pain. Death is not an anomaly here. It is a daily expectation. For a predator looking for camouflage, it was the perfect hunting ground. Cullen was an odd presence from the start. Colleagues described him as socially awkward, quiet, and prone to strange, brooding silences. But he was also dependable. He picked up the shifts that no one else wanted: nights, weekends, holidays. He made himself indispensable. He was the shadow in the corner that everyone got used to seeing. It was here that the killing began. One of his first confirmed victims was Judge John Yango, a 72-year-old man suffering from severe burns. Yango was in pain, but he was stable. Then, inexplicably, his heart stopped. The code team rushed in, but he was gone. At the time, it was written off as a tragic consequence of his injuries. It wasn't until years later that investigators discovered Yango had been injected with a massive overdose of lidocaine, a drug used to stabilize heart rhythms, but deadly in high concentrations. Cullen later admitted that he felt a rush of power during these moments. In the chaos of a code blue, amidst the shouting doctors and the crashing defibrillators, he was the only one who knew the truth, that this wasn't a natural death. It was a murder, and he had gotten away with it. This initial success emboldened him. He realized that in a hospital, death is often assumed to be natural, and no one looks at the nurse holding the syringe. Most serial killers use violence, guns, knives, strangulation. Charles Cullen used chemistry. He turned the very tools of healing into weapons of mass destruction. His drugs of choice were medications of opportunity, specifically digoxin and insulin. Digoxin is a heart medication derived from the foxglove plant. In the correct dosage, it helps a struggling heart beat stronger. But in a lethal overdose, it causes the heart to beat chaotically, eventually leading to cardiac arrest. It is a terrifying way to die, often causing nausea, hallucinations, and a feeling of impending doom before the heart finally gives out. Insulin, on the other hand, crashes a patient's blood sugar, leading to a coma and brain death. What makes Cullen's method so horrific was its randomness. He didn't always choose a specific target. Often, he would walk into the supply room, take a syringe of insulin, and inject it into several random 4 bags hanging on the rack. He had no idea who those bags would go to. It could be a terminal cancer patient, or it could be a young mother recovering from a routine surgery. He turned the hospital into a game of Russian roulette. A nurse would come in, grab a bag for their patient, and unknowingly hook them up to a lethal weapon. Cullen might be in the cafeteria or at home sleeping when the patient died. This detachment allowed him to dissociate from the crime. He wasn't stabbing anyone. He was just alleviating suffering, as he would later claim. But the reality was far darker. He was poisoning the entire water supply of the hospital, watching from a distance as the chaos unfolded. Charles Cullen is the villain of this story. The American hospital system is the accomplice. Over the course of 16 years, Cullen was fired or forced to resign from at least 5 different nursing jobs due to suspicious behavior. At St. Barnabas, security guards found him contaminating 4 bags. At Warren Hospital, he was investigated after 3 elderly women died from overdoses. So, why wasn't he arrested? Why wasn't his nursing license stripped? The answer lies in the terrified corporate culture known as passing the trash. Hospital administrators were paralyzed by the fear of liability. If they admitted that they had employed a serial killer, the lawsuits from victim families would bankrupt them. The hospital's reputation would be destroyed. So, instead of calling the police, they chose the path of least resistance. They fired him. They would call him into an office, offer him a quiet resignation, and send him on his way. When his next employer called for a reference check, the previous hospital would simply confirm his dates of employment. Yes, Charles Cullen worked here from 1992 to 1993. They wouldn't mention the stolen drugs. They wouldn't mention the dead patients. They wouldn't mention the security reports. They sanitized his record to protect their own bottom line. This corporate cowardice allowed Cullen to maintain a valid nursing license for over a decade. He wasn't a criminal genius eluding the FBI. He was a liability problem being shuffled from one legal department to another. Unchecked by the system, Cullen moved across the border into Pennsylvania. He worked at Liberty Nursing Center, Easton Hospital, and Lehigh Valley Hospital. Everywhere he went, the death rate followed. At St. Luke's Hospital in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the situation became so obvious that other nurses began to joke about it. They called him the Angel of Death, a dark humor that masked a terrifying reality. Colleagues noticed that when Cullen was on shift, code blues skyrocketed. They noticed that he was often in rooms where he wasn't assigned. At St. Luke's, several nurses found empty vials of heart medication and the hazardous waste bins medication that hadn't been prescribed to any patient in that unit. Brave nurses tried to blow the whistle. They went to their managers with the empty vials. They pointed out the correlation between Cullen's shifts and the deaths. But they were ignored. In one infuriating instance, a nurse who raised concerns was reprimanded for spreading malicious rumors and creating a hostile work environment. Cullen, realizing the heat was on, would simply quit before he could be fired and move to the next desperate hospital that needed a night shift nurse. During this period, his personal life was collapsing. He filed for bankruptcy, his wife filed for divorce, and a restraining order citing his bizarre cruelty to the family pets, and he attempted suicide multiple times. Yet, he was still allowed to be responsible for the lives of vulnerable patients. The contrast is staggering. A man deemed too unstable to see his own children was left alone with yours. In September 2002, Charles Cullen landed at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey. This would be his final and deadliest hunting ground. By this point, Cullen was escalating. He wasn't just killing occasionally. He was killing with a frenzy. In a period of just 13 months, he is suspected of killing at least 13 patients at this single facility. At Somerset, Cullen exploited a digital loophole in the hospital's drug dispensing system, known as the Pyxis Machine. The Pyxis is like an ATM for medicine. To get a drug, a nurse logs in and selects the patient. Cullen discovered that if he requested a high-risk drug like Digoxin, the drawer would open. He could grab the vial and then immediately hit the cancel button on the screen. The machine would record the cancellation, implying he made a mistake and didn't take the drug. But in reality, the drug was in his pocket. Because the transaction was canceled, it didn't flag the pharmacy to restock immediately, and it didn't bill the patient. It created a ghost transaction. Cullen did this hundreds of times. He was stealing enough drugs to kill an army. He was no longer trying to be subtle. He was intoxicated by the power, ordering medication for patients who were not even under his care, roaming the halls like a specter. Somerset Medical Center eventually noticed the irregularities in the Pyxis logs, but just like the hospitals before them, they dragged their feet, conducting an internal review for months while the bodies continued to pile up in the morgue. One of the most persistent myths about medical serial killers is the angel of mercy defense. Cullen tried to claim he only killed patients who were terminal to end their suffering. This was a lie. A look at the victims at Somerset proves that he was not an angel. He was a butcher. Take Floringall, for example. He was a beloved 40-year-old vicar. He had been admitted to Somerset for pneumonia. He was sick, yes, but he was recovering. His doctors expected him to be discharged within days. He was sitting up, joking with his family, and planning his return to the church. Then Charles Cullen walked into his room. Hours later, Gall went into a massive cardiac arrest. His death was agonizing and terrifying, completely the opposite of a merciful passing, or consider Jin Kyung Han, a 40-year-old woman. She was not terminal. Or Michael Stranko, a 21-year-old man in for a routine spleen surgery. These people had their whole lives ahead of them. Cullen didn't kill them because they were in pain. He killed them because they were available. He killed them because he was having a bad day, or because he felt slighted by a colleague, or simply because he wanted to see if he could bring them back from the brink of death. He treated these human beings like laboratory rats in his own twisted experiment. The angel of mercy narrative is an insult to the victims. He wasn't alleviating pain. He was inflicting it. In the midst of this darkness, there was a friendship. Amy Loughren was a nurse at Somerset who worked the night shift with Cullen. Amy was battling her own health issues, cardiomyopathy, and she was a single mother working herself to the bone. To Amy, Charles Cullen wasn't a monster. He was Charlie. Charlie was her confidant. When Amy was too weak to lift a patient, Charlie was there to help. He asked about her daughters. He brought her coffee. They shared secrets during the long, quiet hours of the night shift. Amy trusted him with her life. But in October 2003, the New Jersey State Police finally got involved after the suspicious death of Floringall. Detectives Danny Baldwin and Tim Brown began digging into the Pyxis records. They saw the pattern of canceled withdrawals, but they weren't medical experts. They needed an insider to interpret the data. They approached Amy. The moment the detective showed Amy the scroll of records is one of the most heartbreaking moments in this story. She looked at the list. She saw Charlie's ID. She saw the drugs, digoxin, insulin, epinephrine. And then she compared the timestamps to the deaths. The pattern was undeniable. The realization physically sickened her. The man she considered her best friend, the man she had led around her children, was a serial killer. Her world collapsed, but in that collapse, she found the resolve of steel. She realized she was the only one who could be close enough to stop him. The police had circumstantial evidence, but they needed a confession to ensure Cullen didn't slip through the cracks again. They asked Amy to do the unthinkable, wear a wire and meet Charlie for dinner. Imagine the terror of that night. Amy had to sit in a small booth at a local restaurant, inches away from a man she now knew had killed dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people. She had to pretend they were still friends. She had to suppress her fear and her rage. In the recording, you can hear the strain in her voice. She appeals to his humanity. She says, "I know you did it, Charlie. I know you're hurting people. You have to end this." Cullen was suspicious. He was guarded. He didn't give a full confession at the diner, but he said something chilling. When Amy pushed him, he simply said, "I want to go down fighting." He didn't deny it. He didn't say, "I didn't do it." He accepted his fate as a combatant. That conversation gave the police enough probable cause to arrest him. On December 12, 2003, Charles Cullen was taken into custody in the parking lot of the restaurant. Amy Loughren had risked her life to betray her friend, but in doing so, she saved countless future patients. Arresting him was one thing. Getting him to talk was another. For hours, Cullen sat in the interrogation room at the Somerset County Prosecutor's office and gave them nothing. He stared at the wall. He mumbled. The detectives were hitting a brick wall. They decided to play their trump card. They brought Amy back in. They left her alone in the room with him. This was the breaking point. Amy didn't scream at him. She touched his hand and told him that the investigators would understand if he just told the truth. She gave him a way out, a way to be the good guy one last time. Under her gentle pressure, the dam broke. Cullen began to talk. He admitted to killing Florian Gall. He admitted to killing Judge Yengo. And then came the math. When detectives asked him to estimate his victim count, they expected him to say 5 or 10. Cullen shrugged and said he couldn't remember them all. He guessed about 40, but investigators knew that was a lie to minimize the horror. When they looked at the spike in death rates at every single hospital he worked at over 16 years, the statistical probability was terrifying. Experts who reviewed the case files believe the true number is closer to 400. If that estimate is accurate, Charles Cullen is not just New Jersey's worst killer. He is the most prolific serial killer in the recorded history of the world. Charles Cullen eventually pled guilty to 29 murders and 6 attempted murders in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. He accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, agreeing to cooperate with authorities to identify more victims. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms. He is currently rotting in New Jersey State Prison, and he will die there. But locking up Cullen wasn't enough. The public demanded to know why 5 separate hospitals had failed to stop him. The outrage led to the passing of the Healthcare Professional Responsibility and Reporting Enhancement Act, commonly known as the Cullen Law. This law changed the way American healthcare operates. It mandates that hospitals must report any employee they fire for incompetence or negligence to a state clearinghouse. It stripped away the legal immunity that allowed administrators to give neutral references to dangerous employees. It legally ended the practice of passing the trash. While the law is a victory, it came too late for hundreds of families. The legacy of Charles Cullen is a permanent scar on the medical profession. He proved that the systems we trust are fragile, and that sometimes the only thing standing between a patient and a predator is a single brave nurse who refuses to look away. We want to believe that hospitals are sanctuaries. We want to believe that the person standing by our bedside is an angel. And it is important to remember, 99% of the time, they are. Nurses are the backbone of healthcare, often working exhausted hours to save our lives. But Charles Cullen is a terrifying reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears scrubs. Sometimes it holds your hand. And most frightening of all, sometimes the institutions we trust to protect us are more concerned with their quarterly budget than your heartbeat. Charles Cullen is in prison for life. But the hospital administrators who shuffled him around, the ones who covered up the crimes to save money, never faced criminal charges. Do you think they should be sitting in a cell right next to him? Let me know your verdict in the comments. If this investigation opened your eyes, please hit the like button. It helps us expose more stories like this. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. Until then, ask what's in the IV bag. And stay safe.